Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Sacco, and this is my son, Rafe Sacco. And we are going to just share a couple of ideas about friendship, surprise, algría, and community. And these ideas are going to be guided by some of the core and key ideas that Gustavo Esteves shared with me over the years. So first of all, I just want to start with the concept of friendship. So when I first went to Mexico on Gustavo's invitation in 2002, he sent me first to Cuernavaca to work with Cesar Añorve, who lived in a little barrio, Ocotepec, outside of Cuernavaca. And on the Calle Dolores was the same street that the famous Ivan Illich lived in. And there, Illich had built his library, the CDOC Library. And the CDOC Library was where Illich brought his friends from all around the world. And for Gustavo, he always talked about how for Illich, it was friendship that saved him, and how at a certain moment in his life, the world was so crazy, the dangers in the world were so great that he was at risk of losing his mind. And I think when I never really understood that until I read a book of essays by Ivan Illich called In the Mirror of the Past. And in that book, I remember reading one and saying, I think I know what Gustavo was talking about here. So back in the 60s, Illich was amongst many who was really trying to get the Catholic Church to come out against nuclear weapons, because it was just such a horror of such a scale that it was almost unimaginable. And trying to fight that and change that almost killed him. And so one of the ways that Illich seemed to escape the depression and the idea that somehow he had to become as great and monstrous as the superpower nations that were threatening each other with nuclear powers, to be able to disarm that, instead, he started to celebrate something much more subtle, something much more almost contradictory, but it's really paradoxical. And that was the joy and the hope that was found in friendship. And so it was through friendship and through kind of letting go of trying to be the way, like what did Gustavo used to always say, be careful the enemy you choose, for you must become like that enemy to defeat them. And so on the other side of that, maybe what Illich and Gustavo were trying to do with their friendships and with their civil society friendships that formed together into social movements was to look at a way of constructing a hammock or a network or an alliance or a federation or a movement of movements, as the case of the APO, to show through conviviality and through celebration and through hopeful relationships what might be possible, to kind of do the work of preparing for that change and not trying to force that change on the world. So friendship was always so important for Illich, as much also for Gustavo, who really, carried Illich's legacy forward. One of the things that was said recently in the eulogies for Gustavo was, it was amazing how many people with whom Gustavo had relationships. And in order to have that many relationships going all at once, it was obvious that Gustavo had a massive heart. And he really did have a massive heart, and his generosity it knew no bounds of his spirit. But because he was your friend and he celebrated friendship, did not mean that whatever you did was okay. In fact, Maestro Gustavo, like his friend Ivan Illich, could be one of the most difficult friends in the world to have, because for him, that friendship also had to be measured against being able to challenge each other. And Gustavo always had challenges and always tried to enroll people in doing the good work. So what can I say about friendship more in the sense of what Gustavo was going to talk about in his lecture? I guess all I could say is if we try to change the world, it's something that's very difficult, if not impossible. But as the Zapatistas say, making a new world in which many worlds belong is something poetic, something beautiful, and something that might just be possible. And conviviality and friendship was really the prerequisite for starting to have that conversation. So that's one of the concepts that I just want to briefly share. Second concept, surprise. Okay. Surprise is very, very important because surprise is when something is able to disarm you, something is able to penetrate your expectation of what you thought was going to happen, something different happens. Gustavo always believed that one of the most important thing a modern person could do, especially someone from North America or from the Western cultural matrix to do, would be to be able to suspend their disbelief, to be able to put aside their cultural lenses so they could actually start to see something different, something new that they had not seen before arise. And so when the students would come to Oaxaca, one of Gustavo's first jobs always was to get them to realize that they were seeing the world through a very, very complex, set of presuppositions and perceptual lenses. And he would challenge them on things as basic as, do you think you live on planet Earth? And the students would say, of course I live on planet Earth. And he would say, no, you don't live on planet Earth. What is that? A big blue orb in the sky? And the students would say, well, I've seen it from space. And Gustavo would try to drive home to the students that they had never lived on planet Earth, but they had lived in places that were on a planet, but that they should not reduce their living on the planet to the understanding of that blue bulb in the sky. And so when Gustavo would talk about surprise, for me, one of the things that I always took away from that idea was the importance of letting things that fall outside of our perceptual lenses appear to us, get through to our mind, get through to our hearts. And sometimes that surprise, we didn't make sense of it right away. So I think it was also important. Gustavo used to say that he was struggling in the dark to find the language and the words to express this new radical pluralistic intercultural myth that was emerging. And I think that was something that for me, I saw Gustavo struggle with year after year for the 22 years that I knew him. And so, what did he say once in one of his writings? The first step is to name the unbearable. Because in naming the unbearable, I think it was a quote from Václav Havel, in naming the unbearable, it's the first step. And so when the Zapatistas said, ya basta, they were naming the unbearable. But then what next, right? What comes after naming the unbearable? Because you got to as Gustavo argued time and time again, you had to transform those struggles of resistance into struggles for liberation. And that's what the Zapatistas were doing. And that's what Gustavo dedicated the last 40 years of his life from the time he escaped the Echeverria government to go and live in Oaxaca and begin that work of cultural and community regeneration in the communities. So this idea of surprise is very, very much connected for Gustavo, to this idea of the poetic work of being open to and continually renewing the work of making a world in which many worlds belong. And then that is to say, to really on the path, changing the direction of the path. That is to say, being open to the change in the direction, which might be a surprise. In one of his chapters on the celebration of Zapatismo, he always talked about how, the Zapatistas had the saying of changing the direction of the path while walking in the path. And I think that that's really important, that as certain as we are about certain concepts and ideas, that we don't make those abstract concepts and ideas more real than reality, and that we are able to put aside the lenses and be able to see with an open heart and an open mind what is right in front of us. And I think that that's something Gustavo really would struggle with time and time again when the students would come to Oaxaca, is these, to help them find the tools to be able to realize that they were wearing the lenses of development and how to take those lenses off. And that taking them off could be very difficult. And so cultivating an openness to surprise was very important. So when the students come to Oaxaca, we want them to see past Mexico Imaginario. We want them to see past the superficial layers that are imposed. And we want them to be able to see in a deeper sense, Mexico Profundo, the indigenous Mexico that really gives the shape and context to the social struggles, the indigenous communities, and the ancient cultures and communities of Oaxaca, of Chiapas, and of Mexico in general. And so Mexico Profundo, in a sense, is for some people a surprise, but it's a surprise that has always been there. And so how do we get the students? Gustavo would always struggle to find a way to get the students to put aside those perceptual lenses. So another concept, okay? There's friendship, there's surprise, there's algría, and there's community. So algría is, to experience algría, Gustavo always talked about the comida. And he always talked about the comida in the sense of a relationship in Mexico that was not reducible to an economic transaction. In English, we have the terrible saying, there's no such thing as a free meal. But the comida is truly a free meal, but not in an economic sense. The comida is the place around the hearth. He always liked to celebrate the hearth, the place that in the choza, in the el fueguito, where the fire and the little bit of coffee and the little bit of tortilla and the little bit of food is offered, and it brings the family together, and whatever it is that is there is shared amongst everyone. And that comida, for me, some of the best comida I ever shared was at Gustavo's table with him and Nicole. And he really brought that hospitality, that gift of that hospitality, that famous Mexican Mexico Profundo hospitality and joy in that hospitality. He would share it in such a deep and beautiful way. And Nicole and him were the masters of hospitality and conviviality at the supper table. And I would say that for me, I learned that so deeply in Oaxaca. And I learned that we have to see the joy in the simplest little things, in the food, in the table, in the celebration of the fiesta, in the old tradition of the Galaguetza. And that joy was very much something that came out of the rootedness in the community. So when I was a student at the Unitierra, we had a seminar that lasted 3 years. And it was a seminar on Ivan Illich's book, Tools for Conviviality. So when you asked me to speak about Gustavo's concept of alegría, I immediately thought of Ivan Illich's concept of conviviality, convivialidad. And that conviviality, that alegría comes when we as a community of learners, as a community of researchers, as a community of activists, as a community of, people trying to do the good work, live the good work, we come together and we share in that abundance that we have. I remember very clearly Gustavo saying to me, before I arrived in Oaxaca the first time. He said, Michael, we don't have lots of money, but we have lots of friends. So sooner or later, we always end up achieving what it is that we're meant to achieve. He also said very tellingly, it's good that we've made, Michael, all these plans so that when you come to Oaxaca, we can change them all. And conviviality and tools for conviviality is really what I see as my life's vocation, as being, you know, the founder of a learning community social enterprise in Toronto that Gustavo talked about as being the Universidad de la Tierra in Toronto. And that conviviality and those tools for conviviality and the workshops and the talleres and the community outreach and the techniques and the agricultural work that Gustavo and the Unitera and the Unitera Chiapas and so many other groups have participated in, you know, is rooted in that algría and nurtures it. When, you know, when I came back to Toronto, I brought that idea of the seminar, but I translated it into a chocolatada, and that was music and ideas and joy. And we used to host the conversations with chocolate. And what I realized very quickly was the chocolatada was not a means to an ends. It was a conviviality. And another way of seeing that conviviality was it was social composting. It was people coming together, finding the words, finding the language, coming together and finding and focusing our ideas around an issue or a set of issues and a concept, and creating the relationships and the concepts and the languages out of which we could build a better world or better worlds. Always plural, right? Not reducing it to one new program. And that social compost for me was always rooted in that conviviality, and it was not a means to an ends. That was something Gustavo definitely always said to me, is do not use civil society as a means to an ends. Participating and living in the discourse and the dialogue is both the means and the ends, because we're going to keep on iterating this. We're going to keep on walking this path. And it's funny because in Gustavo's book, Celebration of Zapatismo, which I had the great opportunity to help him with the first translation of back in 2002 during my first visit to Oaxaca, and I was living up in San Pablo Etla in Gustavo's guest house. I remember seeing how the Zapatistas said they were not the revolution. And the reason they weren't the revolution was they were prepared to kill or be killed in order to preserve the dignity of their communities. And anybody who is willing to kill or be killed in that way should not be a leader, which is a very, very indigenous concept. I discovered years later that, in fact, the Haudenosaunee here in North America have the same thing. If you've ever murdered or killed anyone, you cannot be a condole chief. You cannot be a leader of the community. I thought that was a very, very beautiful concept. But the Zapatistas said that they were the antesala. They were the antechamber to the revolution. And they were helping to create the conditions, the fertile social conditions, the social compost, you might say, out of which an alternative world in which many worlds could belong could be imagined. And so we come to the last concept of community. And Gustavo really didn't love the word community. He loved the concept of comunalidad. And I read that beautiful testament that Jaime Luna, who's the author of Comunalidad from the Sierra Norte, wrote about Gustavo, and it was very touching because Jaime Luna put to words what it was that Gustavo, you know, really felt in his heart. He contributed that concept of comunalidad. What is it? It is not to belong to a community in the sense of an individual being part of a collective. No. Comunalidad in that indigenous Oaxaca sense is to be the community, to be the place. I remember living in a Zapotec village in the Sierra Norte, Oaxaca. And in the time when I was a student of the Universidad de la Tierra, I was probably the first doctoral student at the Unitera back in the day. And we had a Zapotec scholar named Melquiades Cruz, who was there. And he talked a lot about the concept of Diza, Shiza, and Tujen, little Tujen and big Tujen. But that was the way that they described their corner of the Sierra Norte, little Tujen. And big Tujen was the same thing. But they were inseparable from that place. The community was not something other than the valley in which they were living. They were that place. And so this is something that I find that for me I've really struggled with it. I've struggled with it as a North American and someone who very educated in the Western tradition. I've struggled with it through my studies of Indigenous studies here at Trent University as well. And I've struggled with it because it's such a beautiful concept. It's such a beautiful way of being. And yet, once you become an individual, it's really hard to become back to the comunalidad. It's very hard to release that individuality and to see that we are the community. We are our relationships to place and to others. And in that service is how we find ourselves. So, and yet that teaching, that idea of comunalidad has guided very deeply my work and my thinking for the 20 years that I was able to work on this concept. And I remember when Gustavo came to Canada in 2014, he came here in 2014 in the winter. He swore he would never come for another Canadian winter. At that point, he was celebrating a Canadian thinker from the West Coast, I can't remember his name right now, who had come up with this idea, not of communism and not of comunalidad, but of commonism. And that's an idea that I still have to research a little bit more. But basically, it's the realization that today, one of the great challenges of today is to remake, to reclaim, to regenerate, and to reimagine the commons. And for me, as a researcher and a thinker deeply inspired by Oaxaca Profundo and Mexico Profundo and America Profunda, what I see is that the indigenous cacao forest garden is a commons. And in the Sierra Norte, Oaxaca, or in the Chinantla, Oaxaca, or in the Selva Lacandona of Chiapas, what I've seen time and time again is how the land and the people in their ejido and communitarian organizations, that the land is very much an expression of their way of being and living. And so just as Gustavo celebrated the Sin Maíz No Hay País campaign as a way to strengthen those communities and to strengthen that, food culture and resilience and liberation of the maize, my belief is that we also must strengthen the milpa forestal. We must look at how, when you bring the milpa of the field together with the milpa of the forest, you have the conviviality of all the plants in the milpa, and you have the conviviality of all the plants in the forest garden, and then you have the conviviality of all the humans and all the animals, and that this relationship, this complex relationship of agriculture and forests and communities and economics and politics, that these complexities come together in these ways, and that regenerating these traditions of the milpa of the maize and the milpa of the cacao are ways in which we can support the regeneration of the indigenous commons, the comunalidad, and we can hopefully keep it from being co-opted in the process, because sometimes it's very easy that it sounds very pretty, but it just ends up being another way that you get business into the communities. And that's a real big challenge. And I know that was one of Gustavo's greatest sorrows, was seeing all these people with these great intentions to save the people, save the indigenous peoples. And in doing so, they were really, a lot of their projects were just Trojan horses that were actually converting the indigenous communities and the people in those communities into becoming competitive individuals. And so, you know, I would say that for Gustavo, these four concepts were not ideals in the sense of being abstract ideals, but they were tools that he used to help orient himself and help orient those around him to be able to do the work in a good way, in a mindful way, and in an open-minded way, and in a way that was respectful of Oaxaca Profundo, Mexico Profundo, and the indigenous cultures and communities that he dedicated the last 40 years of his life to celebrating and regenerating and getting behind. So, you know, with all modesty, I say that I don't think I can truly do justice to what it was that Maestro Gustavo was going to say, but in 20 years of working with him, these are some of the apertures that he shared with me that helped me to understand a little bit of how he invited me as a collaborator, as an intercultural collaborator, to work with him and see through the doorway and the windows of perception a little bit more clearly. So I hope that helps. Thank you.